So we started 10 after, but let me say, make some remarks about housekeeping, how we're going to proceed, and so on. First thing, we've distributed questions on the cards. If you have a question, please turn it into a sentence. The cards are too small to put a speech on, but we want to have that question and be able to read it when we're on the stage. What we're going to do is each of our three speakers will come up and speak for approximately 15 minutes. Then when they're done, I will moderate a discussion among the three speakers. And as we were walking over here, I realized that they have a lot of questions for each other. And I think that's going to be very interesting. In addition, I will ask some questions, and then we will include as many questions as we can from the cards that, again, are one sentence or two. So with that introduction, let me begin the proceedings. I'm Harry Chrysler, Executive Director of the Institute of International Studies and host of Conversations with History, and I will be presiding here. And I do want to say that what links our three panelists they were all on my program, Conversations with History. So if you want to learn more about them, you can Google conversations.berkeley.edu. And we, in each of the interviews, I really go into biographical background on all of them, but then they talk about issues related to what we're discussing today. This is the Sanford S. Elberg Lecture. It was established in 1987 by the Institute of International Studies in honor of Sanford S. Elberg, Emeritus Professor of Medical Microbiology and Immunology and a beloved Emeritus Dean of the Graduate Division. This lectureship was endowed by his colleagues primarily to honor his contribution to graduate education on the Berkeley campus. His tireless efforts and substantial achievements in building the excellence of graduate education at Berkeley, and anybody who knew Sandy, he did it in such a loving way, and that's why he was honored by his colleagues in this way. And he especially was interested in international studies and global studies because his background was in public health. And so he helped very much to bring Berkeley to the world and bring the global to Berkeley. Previous lecturers have included Ralph Dahrendorf, Victor Weisskopf, Sadako Ogata, Robert McNamara. This is the 25th year of the Elberg Lecture. And I think we've been very privileged in who we've been able to get here to honor Dean Elberg. And we've done two panels. One was on human rights, international law, and the war on terror, and the other was on failed states. And today's event will be the third one in the series. The topic today is the Iranian crisis. Is war inevitable? And we're very pleased to have three panelists. They are Avner Cohen, Karim Sajapur, and Shibli Talami. And before I introduce them, let me say this set of problems is really extraordinary in the way it requires people with different talents and different foci to really look at the problem, because we're talking about the domestic politics of at least three countries, but maybe now the domestic politics of a whole region. We're talking about proliferation, we're talking about deterrence, we're talking about regional dynamics, we're talking about public opinion in all of these countries and throughout the Muslim world. So that's kind of what makes this problem not only dangerous, but really unique, and which led us to invite these three guests today. So let me introduce our three speakers who will speak in alphabetical order. They are Avner Cohen, who is a senior fellow and professor at the James Martin Center for Non-Proliferation Studies at the Monterey Institute of International Studies. He's widely known for his path-breaking history of the Israeli nuclear program and is an internationally recognized author and expert on non-proliferation issues focusing on the Middle East. He is best known for his most acclaimed book, which was Israel and the Bomb, which was published by Columbia University Press in 1998 in English and 2000 in Hebrew. His latest work, The Worst Kept Secret, Israel's Bargain with the Bomb, was published by Columbia University Press. Karim Sajadpour is an associate at the Carnegie Endowment. He joined Carnegie after 4 years as the chief Iran analyst at the International Crisis Group based in Washington and Tehran, where he conducted dozens of interviews with senior Iranian officials and with Iranian intellectuals, clerics, dissidents, paramilitaries, businessmen, student activists, and youth, among others. He's a regular contributor to the BBC TV and radio, CNN, National Public Radio, and he's invariably quoted on all these issues. He has a monograph called Reading Khomeini, and he recently, in the Brookings War Game on this crisis, played the Ayatollah himself. Shibli Talami is the Anwar Sadat Professor for Peace and Development at the University of Maryland College Park and non-resident Senior Fellow at the Saban Center at the Brookings Institution. He has taught at numerous universities. He's a graduate of Berkeley. He served as an advisor to the UN mission to the UN, as an advisor to former Congressman Lee Hamilton, as a member of the U.S. delegation to the Trilateral U.S.-Israeli-Palestinian Anti-Incitement Committee, and on numerous other prestigious bodies. Among his numerous publications is his best-selling book, The Stakes, America and the Middle East, which was selected by Foreign Affairs as one of the top 5 books on the Middle East in 2003. He conducts extensive public opinion surveys in the Arab world and has been a regular commentator in national and international media. And his polls basically have been taking the pulse of the region for many years and actually was a major indicator of things to come before the Arab Spring had happened. So with that, with those introductions, we'll now begin. So first Avner Cohen, then Karim Sajadpour, then Shibli Talami. Avner.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much, Harry, for the kind words for me, for all of us. It is a true pleasure to be again at Berkeley. Berkeley is a unique place in so many ways. Since my days of high school, I thought of this place. Since my days of undergraduate at Tel Aviv University, I thought about studying philosophy here. Ultimately, I studied in Chicago, but I thought of this place greatly. So it's a great pleasure to be here as a guest at Berkeley. My comments today, we have 15-20 minutes, and I have about 9 or so slides, 8 or 9 slides. So it's about 2 minutes to the slides, and I try to give some comments about the Israeli perspective of the current crisis in Iran. But before that, I feel almost compelled to respond to the questions of this program, whether war with Iran is inevitable. Well, my own view is no, it's not inevitable, but at the same time, I do believe that the current status quo that has been growing and has been feeding itself for the last decade is getting closer and closer to the end, to the moment of truth. I do believe that we're going to have, in the next few weeks, another exercise of diplomatic effort to try to find a solution. And to find a solution means a solution that will work for all three and possibly more parties: Iran, the bloc of six, with the United States as one of its major players, and ultimately also Israel. If Israel is going to be left alone, unhappy, something could happen. I was surprised over the years the fact that the status quo was able to sustain itself that much. But I don't believe it can continue in its present form much beyond 2012, perhaps early 2013. So without a diplomatic solution, which I don't believe is going, the chances are very high something else may happen. It's not necessarily war. It could be other forms of dealing with this issue, including semi-militaries like a blockade or other things. But I don't believe that the status quo can sustain itself for too long. With this in mind, let me start with some of my comments about Israel. The Israeli dilemma, which in the last 2 months has been articulated in extreme clarity by some of the players, that's quite a surprise, and I'll say something about that, including Israeli Minister of Defense Barak and Prime Minister Netanyahu, in total opposition to the policy that was under Prime Minister Sharon and even under Olmert, where Israeli leaders hardly said anything in public on this subject. The Israeli dilemma is very much indeed to attack or not to attack Iran in the case of nobody else, deal with Iran, and in the case the status quo would continue without any other solution. I think this is the most, as I said here, the most strategically complex, military complicated, financially costly, and uncertain security dilemma Israel has ever had since its very birth in 1948. It's existential in the sense that a war with Iran, if it's going to come to that, would be existential, not that the future of Israel would be at stake, that would be overstatement, but in the sense it could be the worst war Israel has ever faced, including the 1973 war. Let me mention a little immediate difference between the situation in 1967, when people often refer as the time when Israel faced its most acute security dilemma. In 1967, the sense was Israel has no choice but to take preemption actions vis-a-vis Nasser. This is not the case today. If Israel will take action, it will be very much a decision of the present government, led by Netanyahu and Ehud Barak, to take that kind of action. It will be out of certain kind of consideration and certain kind of deliberation that they have made. The other difference is, of course, geography. All other previous wars were such that it was essentially adjacent to space next to Israel. This time it will be, we're talking about almost 1,500 kilometers away. This is something unprecedented. And of course, the other element is that the warfare itself may have all sorts of new dimensions. One of them could be possibly the first time that serious component of what we call cyber warfare will be in act. And that may be one of the strategic key for various kind of consideration. I will say something about that in a minute. As you know, Israel has taken action as part of the so-called the Begin Doctrine. The Begin Doctrine that was born in June 1981 when Israel attacked Iraq. The Begin Doctrine, briefly stated, is that Israel would not accept or would not tolerate the establishment of hostile nuclear capability, nuclear weapons capability, and would take action and would do everything possible to prevent that kind of situation. Israel used it twice, in some respect even more than twice. The first time was in the 60s, when Israel, in a covert fashion, had this war against German scientists in Egypt in the 62, 63. Israel used it in the 70s, and of course the culmination came in 1981 when it attacked Iraq against the Iraqi nuclear project under Saddam Hussein. In my view, and this is an unorthodox view, very much unconventional view, this was a mistake, in fact, historical mistake, that very much was done by Menachem Begin, who was so obsessed and so motivated by the Holocaust syndrome that he took action at the wrong time. The other Iraqi project that came instead of 1981, that was by enrichment, not by reactors, many facilities, could have been much worse to Israel. And Israel was saved ultimately by the mistake that Saddam himself did when he miscalculated and when he invaded Kuwait in 1990, and ultimately the United States took care of the problem. And we realized of the problem only in retrospect. But we can talk about that. This is not the issue right now. The second time was in 2007 when the Israeli government under Ehud Olmert took actions against the North Korean facility in Syria and destroyed it. However, the differences are very obvious. In the other cases, it was in the two cases in the past, it was a very pinpoint kind of operation against very specific facility, overground, can be easily identified, 2 minutes over the target, and it was gone. In both times, Israel considered as taking certain risks, and despite the risks, they decided to take it. In the case of Iran today, it's obvious to everybody that's going to be a war, and a very, very different kind of war. What has been quite interesting in Israel itself is that since June of last year, 2011, a very different social pattern of dealing with this issue took place. While in the past, the issue was very much adjacent to the taboo over the nuclear issue. It was an aura of taboo that we don't talk about it. We leave the issue entirely to the policymakers. We, the Israeli public, do not debate it, and we delegate our authority to our leaders. This was the case in 1981. This was the case in 2007. In fact, in both cases, the Israeli public hardly knew anything about it. Today, there is an unprecedented, real and lively domestic debate in Israel. It started when what I call the Dagan effect, when Meir Dagan, the former head of the Mossad, retired. And he brought a bus of Israeli journalists to the headquarters of the Mossad in his last day, and he gave them his outlook on the world, on Iran, including phrases such as that military actions against Iran is the silliest idea that he, Dagan, has ever heard, including the very visual reference that Israel would be entitled or would be justified to take military action against Iran only if will be a sword on its neck. This was the phrase he was using, and obviously we are not in that kind of situation. He was trying to give some credit to the other short of military actions, activities that were done. It was hints to the Stuxnet and possibly other kind of operation that were done, but less or short of the military level. What was interesting is that despite the admonition by many people, he continued to these days, I think he was in 60 Minutes just about 2 weeks ago, to continue with his view. But in return, both the Minister of Defense, Ehud Barak, and the Prime Minister, Netanyahu, gave their own version of the story, of the narrative. Barak, in an unprecedented interview he gave to the New York Times, he made it very clear that he believed that action may well be taken. He was talking about the pressure of time, what he called the zone of immunity, which with the movement of centrifuge of the enrichment program, or elements of the enrichment program to under the hills of Pardue, next to the holy city of Qom, it will be becoming more and more increasingly difficult, operationally speaking, for Israel to take an action. And he put some conditions. He talks about effectiveness of such operation. He talks about Barak, about the fact that he believes that the Israeli casualties in that operation are not going to be that high, and that high for him, he even was ready to give a number. He said it's going to be less than 500 casualties, and so forth. Netanyahu responds in his speech just less than 2 weeks ago at AIPAC. He also repeated the argument that we may have no time. He mentioned the fact that Israel is a sovereign, and he clarified that point with his conversation with President Obama. The point is that Israel would be the sovereign decision maker about its own action. And of course, his reference to the Holocaust. By the way, I today had an op-ed in Haaretz, which I attacked very much the way that Prime Minister Netanyahu relies on the so-called the Holocaust issue. Now, let me say something about the issue of the debate. And at this point, I would like to present it into questions. I have my own thought about it. I think there is a great deal of uncertainties about all those issues, so I don't claim that any of my thoughts are necessarily have any superiority, but I want to put it first as questions. The question is first the question of necessity. Is a military strike in the coming months against Iran is truly necessary? Have all other means already been tried and been exhausted? Then there is the question of threat. Does Iran really pose an existential threat to Israel? Interestingly enough, while Netanyahu, for some time, he gives at least the hint, if not the actual explicit answer, that the answer is yes, existential threat. Ehud Barak always avoids to say that. He says that Israel is the strongest country in the Middle East, and no country in the Middle East, at the Middle East of today, can pose to Israel existential threats. Israel may have reasons. In a moment, I'll look at the reasons of Ehud Barak. I think most of them are not the true reasons. And I'll say something about what I think the true reasons. Then there is the question of timing. Is military action really needed now? Can we wait until sanctions work? How far we can wait? Then there is the question of effectiveness. To what extent Israel can do the job in an effective way on its own? Effective way, I think the view in Israel is to have a delay of at least 2 to 3 years, hopefully more. If the delay is less than that, it's not effective and most likely doesn't worth that kind of effort. And of course, the questions of the consequence of the war. It's going to be a war that in so many ways we have never experienced in the Middle East. It could be a war of missiles, and that war can continue and can linger a long, long time. Israel is stronger than Iran, I think, militarily, but to impose upon Iran the realization that the war has to be terminated, I think it would be very, very difficult for Israel to do alone. The Iranians may have stubbornness, and they may have the resolve, and ultimately such a war could create the opposite effect that Israel would like to do. Instead of disunify Iran and allowing various factions to perhaps to take over, it may only unify Iran and may help the Khamenei and the ruling elite, in the current ruling elite. So all these questions are very, very basic for this debate. To try to give answers, I will be happy to do so, but not immediately right now. Let me say also about the current impasse that we are now. You know, very often the debate is preventing nuclear Iran, about preventing nuclear Iran. I don't think this formulation is accurate, and it's manifests the current situation. I think the current situation is that the fight or the struggle between Iran and the rest of the world is not about the bomb. To put it more accurately, it's about the distance that ultimately Iran would be allowed to put its nuclear program in proximity to the bomb. Iran today, under the IAEA, may do all sorts of clandestine operations that will get it closer to the bomb. It is not a way, under being a signatory of the NPT and under the IAEA safeguard, as limited and as problematic as they are, this is not a way for a country to have possession of nuclear weapon and to reach and to build a nuclear posture. I believe that the Iranian nuclear program goes relatively slowly, and it goes with a great deal of caution of the Iranian how far they can go. Iran has not break out towards the bomb. This is inaccurate of the current situation. Iran goes very slowly to position itself to have a short time from the point that it would ultimately position itself and the bomb. It could be measured in weeks, maybe months, maybe even shorter than that. And I think that Iran would like to extract some elements of deterrence from the proximity which is to the bomb. In other words, to enjoy from having the cake and eat it too. Being a member of the NPT, arguing about its limits under the NPT, which there is a great deal of open questions about it, and at the same time trying to extract deterrence in the eyes of its neighbors. This is not technically and formally country with nuclear weapons. And I think that there is difference, and I think this is not just a question of subtlety, technical subtlety, but I think one should keep it in mind. The Financial Times, I thought just in their issue a few weeks ago, they describe it I think in a fair and accurate way. Current evidence suggests that Iran wants the ability to make the bomb, but have not taken a decision actually to build one. Israel, on the other hand, believes that threshold capability is not tolerable. The United States is signaling that weaponization is the red line. The Europeans are flapping around in the middle somewhere. The talks to have any hope of success, there must eventually be clarity about what level of Iranian nuclear capability, that is to say enrichment, and soon reprocessing, because Iran is very soon to finish its nuclear reactor in Iraq. The level of nuclear capability the world can live with, subject to intrusive external monitoring to verify Tehran isn't running a weapons program. Otherwise, there will be nothing to negotiate. Israel refused essentially that Iran will have status of Japan or Japan Plus. Essentially, Iran would like very much to have Japan or Japan Plus, some kind of variant of the Japan status under the NPT. Israel refused to that. The United States is a little further on that issue. And I think that a great deal of the debate is exactly on that kind of line that can be delineated even in more precision, but essentially there is a certain line here to try to find or to identify the threshold. I said something about the official Israeli argument. Ehud Barak and to some extent Netanyahu put usually the public argument on two or three. One is the concern about regional proliferation. If Iran gets the bomb, others in the region would go nuclear as well. Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Turkey, etc. This is the talk about cascade of proliferation if Iran does it. I think this argument is quite baloney. I think that under the present trajectory, when Iran is still under the IEA and signatory of the NPT, if Iran gets a little closer to the bomb, this would not going to trigger some kind of regional proliferation at the present time. Regional proliferation under the present trajectory is unlikely, I think. In any case, decisions on that issue are slow, and it takes decades at best, most likely even more. So that issue, in terms of that, we have time. The other claim is that Iran would adopt a more belligerent, a more adventurous posture, in particular vis-a-vis Lebanon, perhaps even in the Gaza Strip, in a way that would constrain significantly Israeli freedom of action. I think this is also a baloney. One should not consider it, but it's not a prime consideration. I believe that Israel freedom of action, even if Iran would get closer to the bomb under the present trajectory, would not change much. There is concern about nuclear terrorism, yes, but I don't think it's paramount. There is concern about misperception and miscalculation that could lead to a use of nuclear weapon, but even those are quite remote. I think that the real reason which is not visible, which is not being talked about, is the concern of Ehud Barak in particular, but also Netanyahu, that Israel would lose strategic assets, which is most important and Israel has worked very hard over decades to achieve. And that's the unique situation of what I call benign nuclear monopoly in the Middle East. Benign because it has never been declared. Everybody knows about it, everybody recognizes it, but it has never been declared. Israelis believe that under that kind of monopoly, they got peace with Egypt, they got peace with Jordan, they got a certain sense of respect, there is certain kind of perception and images in the Middle East that are critical. Barak believed that not under their watch today, Israel can allow itself to lose that kind of clear monopoly, and a country with resolve should be willing to go to war. In other words, it's somewhat like what the United States was in 47 or 48, before the Soviet Union got its own bomb. And as you know, at the time, we thought that the Soviet Union is not likely to have the bomb before the estimate of the time, mid-53. Some people even thought mid-50s in general, 55. They got it in August 1949. And the United States lost its monopoly. I think the real reason why Netanyahu and Barak believe is strategic. They believe Israel should not allow itself losing that very unique monopoly that survived war, that survived in a peace. Egypt in 1979 was trying to raise the issue, and Jimmy Carter did not allow it to be raised, essentially. So I think that's, from Israeli perspective, that's the crux of the matter. Now, a few final reflections. It's quite interesting that how the Israeli use the issue of the Holocaust. And I think the issue of the Holocaust is so emotional and it's so profound in Israel today. And I think it's, in my view, it's a total irresponsibility on the side of Israeli leaders to use it the way they use it. Unlike leaders in the past who use it in a more moderate way, and people who actually experienced the Holocaust, at least as a leader, not necessarily as Jews under the Holocaust. I'm talking about Ben-Gurion. Begin had to run away from Europe during the Holocaust. Bibi Netanyahu used it in a tactical way, in a bluffing way, and in my view, in a very, very manipulative way. I also want to mention the paradox that if Israel is being left alone, Israel is the most dangerous to take action. If the United States is behind Israel, I think or give a strong sense of assurance to Israel, I think the Israelis would be willing to wait further. So the questions of how the Israelis feel themselves, their existential situation, is very critical to understand their actions for the future. And I don't have time to go to all this issue, but I think there is a great deal of bluffing in the current situation. And it's interesting that the use of bluff is reached almost excellence, and the bluff has more than one target. It's the Europeans, it's the US itself, it's elements within the US, and of course it's the Iranians. And I think the bluff goes also from the other side. I think the Iranians are not less bluffing. I think when the Iranians demonstrate capabilities, they're also bluffing to a great deal. So there is, so to speak, a war of bluffing between Iran and Israel. But at the end, you cannot bluff to the end of time. There could come a time that you need to make some truth to the bluff. And I'm afraid that we are getting closer and closer to that moment. Thank you very much.
It's great to be here. Thank you so much, Harry, for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be on a panel with Avner and Shibli, two people whom I read very frequently. And I see a lot of Iranian-looking faces around the room. If that's the case, I wanted to wish all of you a happy Nowruz, a happy Persian New Year. It's 1391 in the Iranian calendar, and sometimes I think President Ahmadinejad goes by 1391 in the Gregorian calendar as well. What I'd like to do is talk about the context, the political context within Tehran, and then look at US policy options. And Avner touched upon this point, and I would very much agree with him that part of the challenge that Iran poses depends on the context through which you view this issue. If you view this issue, and by this issue I mean the nuclear challenge that Iran poses to Israel, if you view this issue through a geographic context, then Iran is Goliath and Israel is David, right? Israel is a tiny country compared to Iran, which is a much larger country. But if you view this issue in a military context, then Israel is Goliath and Iran is David. Israel has at least 150 nuclear weapons, and Iran is potentially several years away from one. And I think that in the United States and the US domestic political context, we often see Israel as both David and Goliath. It's a country which has, because of its history and its small size, it has very unique security concerns. But on the other hand, we oftentimes say that Israel is a sovereign country and should be allowed to handle its own security. Now, I think when you look at this issue from far away, it oftentimes appears to be a fairly simple problem, a simple conundrum. And that is that if indeed Iran is pursuing a nuclear weapons capability because of a sense of insecurity vis-a-vis the United States, why don't we simply offer Iran security assurances in order to get it to curtail its nuclear ambitions? And what I'm trying to do in my presentation is to offer you a kind of the complexity of this problem. And again, let me start out with some context in Tehran, and I'll rewind to the year 1989. 1989 was a very historic year for a variety of reasons. And within Iran, 1989 was a very historic year because that was the year in which the father of the 1979 Iranian Revolution, Ayatollah Khomeini, dies. And after Khomeini's death in 1989, there were two broad schools of thought within Tehran among revolutionary elites. One school of thought were the so-called pragmatists or reformists, who were very loyal lieutenants of the revolution. And they believed that in order to preserve the system, in order to preserve the revolution, Iran needed to reform the system. And that meant easing social restrictions, opening up the economy, but keeping the political space largely to themselves. And this was the so-called China model. And I think the person who kind of most embodied that philosophy was the former president Hashemi Rafsanjani, who saw himself kind of as an Iranian version of Deng Xiaoping. And the other school of thought within Iran were the so-called principalists. And what they believed was that if Iran, if the Islamic Republic were to compromise on its revolutionary ideals, that could unravel the entire system and lead to the system's collapse. And this school of thought is very much embodied by the current supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, Ayatollah Khamenei. And what influenced Khamenei's thinking very much was the experience of Gorbachev and perestroika in the Soviet Union. Because he believed that when Gorbachev started to compromise on the ideals of the Soviet Union and tried to reform that system, it led to the system's collapse. Basically there was two competing philosophies. One was the hope of becoming like China, and the other was the fear of becoming like the Soviet Union. And the second model was the one that won out, the fear of becoming like the Soviet Union. And for that reason, you see that the Islamic Republic, with Ayatollah Khamenei at the helm, has been very resistant to change, very, very resistant to reform, both in terms of domestic policies and foreign policies. And I would argue now that if you distilled the Islamic Republic of Iran down to its essence, there are three remaining symbolic pillars left of the revolution. That's hostility towards the United States, hostility toward Israel, and the hijab, the veil, which symbolizes Islamic piety. And And again, I would argue that as long as this current Supreme Leader, Ali Khamenei, is in power, it's unlikely that the Islamic Republic will abandon these ideals. And these ideals are cloaked in a kind of ideological purity, but I would argue that they're very much driven by self-preservation, meaning for many years, many of us have argued that if the United States were to engage Iran and reintegrate it into the international community and reintegrate it into the global economy, that will facilitate political reform, political change in Iran. And I think that argument is probably correct. But I think we were naive to think that the Supreme Leader, that Ayatollah Khamenei, would be oblivious to that argument and would embark upon a path that would be detrimental to his own interests. And so I think that from the vantage point of the Obama administration, it's very difficult to reach a rapprochement or modus vivendi with a regime which needs you as an adversary for their own domestic ideological legitimacy. Now let me shift to U.S. policy. And again, the challenge facing the Obama administration. And I think that the discussion about Iran in the United States is very nicely bookended by two quotes from Henry Kissinger. And the first quote from Kissinger is from his book, Does America Need a Foreign Policy? And he was talking about Iran, and I think you'll be surprised to hear that Kissinger said, there are, quote, few nations in the world with whom the United States has more common interests and less reason to quarrel than Iran. But Kissinger also said that Iran has to decide whether it's a nation or a cause. And if it sees itself as a nation and it pursues its national interests, again, there's tremendous overlapping interests between the United States and Iran. But if it continues to see itself as a cause in opposition to the United States, in opposition to Israel, then we're going to continue to butt heads. And when the Obama administration came to office in January of 2009, I would make the argument that they made more of an effort than any previous U.S. administration since 1979 to try to answer this question. Is Iran a nation or a cause? And I would argue that they made more overtures and made more efforts to try to change the tone and context of the U.S.-Iran relationship than any previous administration. And the reason why the Obama administration did this wasn't simply because President Obama is thought of as a peacenik who can bridge gaps between people. It was very much in his national, in the interest of his administration to try to work cooperatively with Iran, given the tremendous influence Iran has over issues like Afghanistan, like Iraq, and again, like the nuclear issue, the issue of nuclear proliferation. And so we can talk about some of the efforts which President Obama made to reach out to Iran. But for the reasons I talked about earlier, I would argue that the Obama administration's unprecedented overtures weren't reciprocated by the Iranians. And so I think after a year or so of a policy of engagement and dialogue, we've gradually shifted towards a policy of coercion, coercive diplomacy. And at the moment, the policy is fairly simple, in that we're trying to subject Iran to enough political and economic pressure in order to compel it to compromise on its nuclear program, to curtail its nuclear ambitions. And there's an old maxim about the Iranian regime, which I think the Obama administration very much believes, and that is that Iran doesn't respond to pressure, it only responds to a lot of pressure. And so for this reason, we've seen unprecedented degrees of pressure in the form of sanctions against Iran's central bank, an oil embargo from the Europeans. Iran has essentially been cut off from the global banking system. And so that is at the moment the policy, to try to resolve this issue in the form of political coercion or in order to avert some type of a military conflagration. But I'll tell you, the challenge, as I see it, from the perspective of the United States, isn't that Iran poses a great national security threat to the United States. If you look at the numbers, Iran's military expenditures are less than 2% that of the United States. Iran's GDP is less than that of the state of North Carolina. So it doesn't, I think when you look at this in a military context, the idea that Iran poses a national security threat to the United States seems a bit far-fetched. But I think that the greatest challenge which Iran poses to the United States, I would say, is a political challenge. And what I mean by that is that almost every elected official in the United States, save for Dennis Kucinich and Ron Paul, have made the argument that Israel's national security is quote-unquote sacrosanct. President Obama has used that word on multiple occasions, that Israel's security, national security, is sacrosanct. And the other side of that coin, when you say that Israel's national security is sacrosanct, is that the United States can't allow a country which rejects Israel's existence can allow them to obtain a nuclear weapon. And so I think that I would argue that the biggest impediment in the US-Iran relationship is actually not Iran's nuclear ambitions, but Iran's hostility toward Israel. And let me pose for you two hypotheticals just to belabor this point. And hypothetical number one is a scenario by which Iran's supreme leader announces that Iran will no longer support groups like Hezbollah and Hamas and will no longer oppose Israel's existence, but it wants to maintain its nuclear program. And hypothetical number two is that Iran announces that it's going to suspend enrichment of uranium indefinitely, but it wants to maintain its hostility toward Israel and support for groups like Hezbollah and Islamic Jihad. Which one of these two scenarios is more likely to lead to a breakthrough in US-Iran relations? I would argue by far the more likely scenario is one in which Iran ceases its hostility toward Israel, but is allowed to keep its nuclear program. That's basically the situation we now have with Pakistan, a country, an Islamic country, which has many nuclear weapons, but doesn't mess with Israel. And there's actually an alliance between the United States and Pakistan. So I would say that the real challenge Iran poses in the US domestic context is not of a national security variety, but more of a political variety. And I'm always reminded of a quote from David Frum, who was President Bush's former speechwriter, who said that he was the guy who wrote the Axis of Evil line. And he told me that that in the context of domestic US politics, a country can enrich uranium, or it can or it can reject Israel's existence, but it can't do both at the same time. And I think the challenge, again, which Iran poses, is that it insists on doing both at the same time. Now, let me move on to where we are now in terms of US policy options. And there are three historic analogies which are commonly invoked to try to capture the character of the Iranian regime and its potential future trajectory. And each of these three historic analogies has a different implication for US foreign policy. And the first historic analogy, which is commonly invoked, is to compare Iran to 1970s China, and to say that the Iranian regime, despite its outward appearances, is a fundamentally pragmatic regime. It's not ideological. And what this simply requires is for the United States to make a very bold gesture, just like how Nixon went to China. Obama needs to go to Tehran and nip this problem in the bud, resolve this problem in the form of a grand bargain. And as I said, I think this policy, that suggestion, that idea of Iran as China scenario was much more in vogue during the Bush administration, at a time when the United States hadn't really attempted dialogue with Iran. But I think after a year of President Obama's efforts to reach out to Tehran, which weren't reciprocated, I think the China analogy is no longer in vogue. And I think the crux of the issue is that in China, during the Chinese Cultural Revolution, hostility towards the United States wasn't necessarily a central pillar. For the Iranian Revolution, it was very much a central pillar, this animosity towards the United States. Now, the second analogy, which is commonly invoked, and this analogy is most commonly invoked in Israel or in neoconservative quarters in the United States, and that's to compare Iran to Nazi Germany, and to say that this regime is, in fact, it's not pragmatic, it's deeply ideological, it's messianic, and it's undeterrable. And therefore, we need to think about taking military action. And this is an analogy which Prime Minister Netanyahu has made many times over. And what I say to this analogy is that the Iranian regime is certainly at times homicidal, and it's homicidal towards its own population above all, but it's not suicidal. What's paramount for this regime is to remain in power. And so the analogy with Nazi Germany really breaks down when you consider the last 33 years of the Islamic Republic, that it's been a regime which hasn't aspired for territorial expansion. Now, the third analogy, which is commonly invoked, is to compare Iran to the Soviet Union, not in terms of the scope of its power, but in terms of the nature of its system. That it's a regime which combines both ideology and pragmatism. Again, it's not Iran is not a global superpower; it's a regional power. But I think the policy implications of the Soviet analogy are to say that, listen, we've engaged before with regimes in the past which have not only had nuclear ambitions, but they've had hundreds, if not thousands, of nuclear weapons. And we can essentially dialogue with that regime, not necessarily to resolve our differences, but to contain our differences, until the regime is eventually forced to change under the weight of its own internal contradictions and economic malaise. And I'm always reminded of this great line from Jon Stewart, who was talking about Dubai. And if you've ever been to Dubai, this will ring true. He said that Dubai is what happens when Las Vegas and Saudi Arabia have a baby. And if I had to use that Jon Stewart formulation about Iran, I would say that in some ways Iran is kind of a hybrid between the Soviet Union and the Taliban. It's kind of a diluted version of each. As I said, it's not a superpower like the Soviet Union. It's a regional power. It's not as fundamentalist as the Taliban, but it certainly has some of those tendencies. And again, U.S. foreign policy towards the Soviet Union in the 1980s can be an instructive template in our dealings with Iran. That we dialogue with them, again, not necessarily because we think or we hope it can resolve our differences, but it can contain our differences. And eventually, the current of history will catch up with the Iranian regime. Now, in the last couple of minutes, I just want to talk about what would happen in the event of an Israeli strike on Iran. Let me speculate a bit. As Harry mentioned, I had the unfortunate task of playing the Iranian supreme leader in one of these war simulations. And it was a very interesting experience for me in that I went out of it with a much different sense of what I went into it with. And I would say my kind of few chief arguments against a military strike on Iran, Israeli military strike on Iran, are the following. One is that, as Avner mentioned, according to Israel's best estimates, if they were to take military action against Iran's nuclear facilities, it would set back Iran's nuclear timeline 1 to possibly 3 years, best case scenario. My great concern is that it could entrench these hardline elements within the Iranian regime for another decade, if not another generation. So when you do kind of a cost-benefit analysis, on the benefit end, you're only buying yourself 1 to 3 years, but you could potentially be buying the regime another decade, if not another generation. And I'm happy to talk about that more in the questions. The second part of it, which I thought was interesting of the simulation, was that in a way, Iran had to perfectly calibrate their response to an Israeli strike. Because if they responded too little, they can lose face. But if they respond too much, they could lose their heads. And what I mean by that is that in 2007, Israel bombed a nuclear reactor in Syria. And Syria basically didn't show any response. And for that reason, there was very little international or even Arab condemnation of Israel. And what I calculated as the Iranian supreme leader is that if Israel were to strike Iran, we had to respond in a way to shake the global economy, to make sure that people around the world who are going to fill their car up with gas would feel the pain of our response, and to further inflame the region. And so it definitely warranted some type of response from us. But again, we were worried that if we responded overzealously, if we did too much, that it could warrant massive reprisals from the United States. So there's this very careful calibration that's called for, which is not responding too little, but not responding too much. And let me set up Shibli with, I'll end with the dilemma maybe Shibli can address, and that is that from a policy perspective, I think we've reached an impasse of sorts, in that when you look at the interests of the main three actors in this equation, the United States, Iran, and Israel, Iran, for a variety of reasons, isn't interested in resolving this dispute, and they're not interested in a reconciliation with the United States, because that would be inimical to the interests of the regime. Israel is not interested in a policy of containing Iran, because they fear that that doesn't resolve the problem. Allowing Iran to be a screwdriver turn away from having a nuclear weapon is almost more dangerous than Iran having a weapon, because international concerns will maybe be falsely allayed. And so containment is out, reconciliation is out, and I think for a whole variety of reasons, the United States and the Obama administration is not interested in another war in the Middle East at a time in which, when you talk to members of Congress, they say that the top priority of their constituents is to reduce the U.S. footprint in the Middle East and focus on nation building at home. And the one thing that would defeat those two objectives is a military strike on Iran, which would warrant an even greater U.S. presence in the Middle East and skyrocket oil prices, which would make it much more difficult to focus on nation building at home. So let me end there. I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Well, it's an honor to be back at Berkeley. It always feels like home. Thank you, Harry, for inviting me. It's always good to see my friends, George Breslauer, Bob Price, Bob Powell, faces from my old days at Berkeley when I had wonderful colleagues and mentors and friends, and it always feels like being back home. I'd like to just give you a little bit of a context about the Iranian nuclear issue, particularly the Arab context, but also I want to refer to the Israeli calculation, particularly at the level of public opinion, and a little bit about how Washington sees this issue. There is an axiom, it seems, in our media and discourse that the Arabs are, quote, the Arabs are itching to see a strike on Iran, that Iran is, the threat to the Arab world. And many Arab countries, if not, quote, the Arabs, are asking privately for Israel or the U.S. to strike Iran's nuclear facilities. And I'd like to just address that at the beginning to give you a picture of the complexity of Arab attitudes before the Arab awakening and since the Arab awakening. Now, let's start by differentiating government positions in the Arab world from public opinion. And we know public opinion has become far more important these days in the era of the Arab awakening, and it is substantially different from government calculations. I'll address both a little bit. It is true, I think, at the government level, some of the governments, particularly among Iran's neighbors, considerably worry about Iran as a strategic threat and are worried about Iran's nuclear program. And some of them, in fact, wouldn't mind to see an international military effort against Iran's nuclear program. And some, in fact, are communicating that. But it is certainly far less than a harmonious position across these governments. It is not true across the Arab world. And even within some of the governments that have that position, there are disagreements, and sometimes voiced publicly on this issue. So Arab governments have not one position. They have mixed views on Iran. They know a war with Iran would have consequences for them as well. They worry about those consequences, even if they see Iran also as a threat. And I have to say that some of them who make that assessment, if you want to think, you really want to understand how they see it, think about how Israel saw Iraq attacking Iran in 1980, welcoming a war where two bad countries weakening each other, even if one is less favored than the others. And you can think about how some of those countries think about it. It's not just about Iran, it's also about Israel, even in their own thinking. But Arab public opinion has been far more homogeneous about attitudes toward Iran. And by far, the Arab public does not want to see an attack on Iran. And let me give you some of the data from my public opinion polls across the Arab world, which I have been doing for a decade. And the most recent poll has been after the Arab awakening. We conducted it in October 2011. So we have data to compare pre and post Arab awakening, including in Egypt, obviously a country which had gone through dramatic change, to see how public opinion has shifted in a place like Egypt. And let me start with the following. One question I ask every year is, name the two countries that pose the biggest threat to you personally. That's a question I ask in every country where I poll. And those countries, by the way, include not only Egypt, but Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, two countries that are extremely relevant for Iran, Jordan, Lebanon, and Morocco. And so when I ask this question, it's an open question. I don't name any country to them at all. And the answers have been consistent year after year after year, including after the beginning of the Arab awakening in October 2011. By far, the number one country that is identified as the biggest threat is Israel. And we have roughly across the board, on an average of 80, sometimes even 90% of the Arabs identifying Israel as one of the two biggest threats to them, because they're answering which two countries are the biggest threat to them. By far, the second most biggest threat to them is the United States. Roughly around 70% across the board. It varies from year to year a little bit, but hasn't really significantly been altered. And the third biggest threat is identified as Iran, but guess what? Iran has often gotten less than 10% of the Arab public identifying it as one of the two biggest threats. And even in this year, in 2011, a few months ago, closer to 18% identified Iran as one of the two biggest threats. And the interesting thing is that these numbers hold in terms of trends, although not in degrees, in both the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia, the two countries that have reason to be more concerned about the Iranian threat, whose governments are indeed very concerned about the Iranian threat, and yet their publics identify the U.S., not only Israel, but the U.S. as a bigger threat than Iran. Now, if you put that in perspective, then you understand where the attitudes are to start with. Second, when you ask them, what if Iran does acquire nuclear weapons? Would that be better for the Middle East or worse for the Middle East? They're divided, completely divided. Sometimes the plurality say it's worse, but not a majority. In 2010, in fact, just before the Arab awakening, a majority said the Middle East actually would be better off if Iran were to acquire nuclear weapons. But one thing that has been consistent with an overwhelming majority across the board, including in every Arab countries, is that the overwhelming majority of Arabs consistently reject international pressures to stop Iran's nuclear program. And you can ask why. You can understand that the issue here is double standards, particularly the Israel issue, and they don't trust the agencies that are carrying out the pressure, particularly the U.S. If they see the U.S. and Israel as a bigger threat, you can see how the logic would proceed. Now, to again get a flavor of this psychology, and I call it psychology because this is not an objective analysis of real threat. It's a perception of threat. And to get a sense of how that psychology operates, I went to Israeli citizens who are Arab. I also polled among Jewish Israelis. I'll tell you about their attitudes in a minute. But polling among Arab citizens of Israel, I asked the same question, whether or not they believed that the international community should pressure Iran to stop its nuclear program. And a majority said no, agreed really with the Arab citizens outside. Now remember, these are citizens who are living right next door to Jewish citizens. If Iran were, in fact, to use nuclear weapons, they will be gone too. So they were not projecting that fear. In fact, among them, only 4% supported a strike against Iranian nuclear program. And so you can see how this, again, is an issue of psychology. When you say it's an existential threat, I'm going to come back to that in a minute. It certainly isn't seen to be an existential threat by a large segment of Israelis, and certainly Arab Israelis. So it's not about an objective. I'm not saying that their views are correct. I'm saying that whether it's Jews or Arabs, they're getting this. They're making their assessment through a different route than straight logic of the actual security situation. What about the Israeli Jewish public opinion and overall Israeli public opinion? I've done 2 polls recently there, one back in November and one just 2 weeks ago on the eve of Prime Minister Netanyahu's visit to Washington, specifically on the nuclear issue. And I want to give you just a flavor, first of all, of the November poll, because that was interesting in and of itself. 90% of Israelis, that's 90% of Israelis, think that Iran will eventually get nuclear weapons. Whatever the government is doing or not doing militarily, politically, 90% of Israelis think that Iran will eventually get nuclear weapons. In the November poll, something else was interesting. And that is that 2/3 of Israelis said they will accept a nuclear weapons-free zone in the Middle East that includes full Israeli disarmament. If, in fact, Iran will agree to having no nuclear weapons verifiably with inspectors, and the Arabs agree to the same thing, which is something that goes against the notion, obviously, of this is the ultimate weapon that Israel has. Now, I happen to think, by the way, that part of this has to do with something that Avner alluded to, which has to do with the Israeli politicians speaking of the Iranian nuclear threat, quote, as an existential threat. And what that has done is, in fact, terrify the public more than terrify the international community. What it has done is that it essentially told the Israeli public, if Iran does acquire nuclear weapons, then it is likely to use them, and then we have no place here. And that's why, as you could see, Avner made the argument against this existential threat notion. Why Barak has made this argument against the existential threat notion. Why Meir Dagan and Halevi, of former Mossad chiefs, have made the argument against using this language. But that language seems to have had, in my opinion, an impact on the Israeli public, where in fact is now an issue. If you compare, it'll be a Holocaust if they were to acquire it. What if the next morning you wake up, in fact, Iran has nuclear weapons? What does that do to the psychology? I think the Israelis are prepared to give it up if, in fact, they can guarantee the Iranians don't. And I think this is an issue that is ongoing in terms of assessing the impact of the posture that the government takes to the impact on their own people, not on the Iran or the Arabs or the rest of the international community. It's fascinating to look at that picture. In the more recent poll, 2 weeks ago, we specifically asked whether the Israeli public endorses an Israeli military strike against Iran without American support, if the U.S. didn't back it. And we found that only 19% of Israelis supported an Israeli strike without American support, which I'll tell you in a minute is actually comparable to what we find here in the United States. And by the way, this existential threat argument, if it's having an impact in Israel, we don't know it's having an impact in the U.S. And what kind of impact it's having in the U.S. in the poll that we just did 2 weeks ago here in the United States, what we found is that a majority of Americans think that if Iran does acquire nuclear weapons, it will use them against Israel. And this is, we haven't seen that anywhere before, but there is this sense that it will use them against Israel. But 19% of Israeli public, only 19% support an Israeli strike without American backing. And that's not because they fear American retaliation. In fact, when you ask them, what do you think would happen if Israel went ahead and attacked Iran anyway without American support, what do you find? You find that a majority of Israelis think that America will support them anyway, at least diplomatically, but even militarily. And only 15% say that there will be repercussions in terms of the U.S. Limiting its aid. So they're not worried about, America punishing them for not listening to them. They're worried more about consequences, because when you ask them what would happen if, in fact, Israel attacks Iran, they agree with Karim. And that is only a minority think it'll hurt the Iranian government. When you ask them whether this will be a war that would last days or weeks or months or years, a majority think it would last months or years. So their fear of the consequences is the reason why they're reluctant to go, certainly without American support. That is the general flavor of American public opinion. And fascinating, by the way, the poll went into the field right after one of our Republican candidates for president, Rick Santorum, announced that in a debate that President Obama was throwing Israel under the bus and that he was in fact helping Iran acquire nuclear weapons. It was reported in the front pages of Israeli newspapers. We went to the field right after, and interestingly, we asked the Israeli public in the following days what the preference is for the next American presidents. We paired Obama with every one of the Republican candidates, Romney, Santorum, Ron Paul, and Gingrich. Obama beat every single one of them and tied Romney, but beat every single one of them. Among Israeli Jews, actually, he beat every single one of them, including Romney, within the margin of error. But beat Santorum, the biggest margin was against Santorum. And Ron Paul, who was actually, who's against the war with Iran, did better than Santorum in Israeli public opinion. So it was kind of an interesting, assessment of the public, how the public is affected by these American debates in the meanwhile. Let me turn very quickly to, I want to tell you how I interpret the Washington view of the current choices. But let me briefly summarize the finding from the American public opinion poll that I conducted with my colleague Steve Cull 2 weeks ago here in the U.S. about the attitudes toward the war. We also found that only 24% of Americans support an Israeli strike on Iran, and the majority wants the U.S. to try more to try the diplomatic option, and they agree with the Israeli public on consequences. Only roughly 40-some% think it would actually hurt the Iranian government. And most believe that the war would go on for months and years, not days or weeks. So there's a worry about the consequences. But how does the Washington elites and the Obama administration sees this? Let me start with the Israeli issue. And the Israeli issue is really critical, and I think Karim is right. Obviously, there is a nuclear proliferation issue that does worry the administration, separate from Israel. They've been an anti-proliferation administration, and they're taking on, multi-projects in that direction. But there's no question that the importance of this Iran issue is twofold. The fact that Iran is hostile to Israel, as well as the nuclear issue. It's not just the nuclear issue, and that makes it far more central in Washington thinking. The big question for Washington over the past few months has been whether the Israeli government is merely bluffing or really intends to strike. And I can tell you that it's very easy to make arguments about bluffing. And the bluffing part has been understood at three different levels. One is there is an assumption, and I don't think it's just administration assumption, I think across many of the elites in Washington, certainly the Democratic elites, that the Netanyahu government wants to distract from the Palestinian-Israeli issue, that Iran serves that. Note how the Palestine-Israel question has not been important over the past few months with the highlighting of Iran. Two, that Israel can use it as an instrument to put pressure on Iran through sanctions, but also to extract some things from the U.S. There are always lists of demands when you are being asked to refrain from attacking, and Israel can get more. But the third one, and I think that is widely held view, is that the Prime Minister of Israel really sees it as his mission to help bring down President Obama in our elections, that he feels that the Iran card can be played in a manner that would help the Republican candidates. So this is kind of the bluffing arguments that people debate or not debate and think about. And I would say that probably up until 4 months ago, I think most people within the administration were on the bluffing side of the assessment. They thought that the chances higher than 50-50 that the Israelis were bluffing. They looked at the assessment of consequences and everything else, and they made that assessment. Something happened 4 months ago, and I can't exactly figure out what it was, perhaps maybe 3 months ago, that led to a shift in the assessment that's been reported in the press to that the chance is better than 50-50 that the Israelis are not bluffing. And I think that's when the Obama administration went to high gear with high-profile visits to Israel, trying to dissuade them from attacking. Now, why that is the case is, obviously a debatable question. People can, there may have been some intelligence that they picked up that we don't know about that indicated that the preparations were far more serious than had been anticipated before. It may have been just an assessment of all the issues. It's hard to know. But once they made that assessment, it became a priority for them to assure that Israel doesn't do it, because the calculation goes like this. If Israel is in, America is in. Even if the U.S. court gives Israel a red light, it's hard to envision, once Israel starts a war with Iran, it is hard to envision the U.S. can keep out of it. Not only because of what the Iranians may do or not do, or the possible consequences for the international economy, but also in terms of, American public opinion and congressional public opinion. It's black and white. I mean, there are good guys and the bad guys. It's very clear who the good guys are. It's very clear who the bad guys are. And the bad guys are going to be at war with the good guys. And, whatever happened the day before the war doesn't matter anymore. You're at war, and you get drawn in. So the assumption the administration is it's almost impossible for the U.S. to find a way to stay out if the Israelis, in fact, attack, and that's why they went into full gear. Now, let me give you my own final assessment of what I think the Israeli thinking is, and why I am of the opinion that the chance of an Israeli attack is more than 50-50, separate from what the US government is saying. Now, I can't tell you about timing because my logic is not tied to month or specific date, although if I were in the Israeli government's position, I would have to say that if I'm going to do it, an American election year is not a bad time to do it. But so the timing issue may be good, but I don't think the Israelis would ever have to doubt that the U.S. is going to support them, whether it's going to be a Republican president or a Democrat, before an election, after an election, just because of the logic that I mapped out. It's hard to envision the U.S. will stay out or will not take their side in this environment. So I don't think the timing issue in that regard is going to be the critical one, unless it's a politically motivated timing related to our elections. The reason why I think it's more probable is an Israeli notion of deterrence and a psychology of. It's not about Iran ever using nuclear weapons, although I think certainly some Israelis think they do. Most people, I think, in the military strategic establishment don't really think that, given Israeli capacities of retaliation. But there are two issues, I think, that are really big here in the Israeli thinking. One is what one might call, and I think has been called, the issue of escalation dominance. And why is Israel wanting to be the only nuclear power in the Middle East? It is really about Israel reserving the ability to escalate a fight any given time to prevent wars of attrition. And not to fear, and to know that the very top of the ladder of escalation, it has a winning card. And you don't want to neutralize that. And an example of that would be, let's imagine that Iran does have the capacity to hit Israel with conventional missiles. These cannot win a war for Iran. Conventional missiles are just like bombs. In terms of the payload, is not very heavy. They're not going to create as much damage as sustained air bombings or ground campaign. They will create some damage. There will be some casualties. You can even assess that you can absorb them. But if you can imagine that the Iranians have the capacity and retain the capacity to lob 6 of these every day at Israel. Hezbollah was able to lob 100 a day for 5 weeks, even while Israel sustained heavy bombings. What that does is it disrupts life. Look at what happened last week when there was a few days of relatively low-level fighting between Hamas and Israel in the south. It put 1 million Israelis in shelters for a few days, and it paralyzed life. And no one died on the Israeli side. More died on the Palestinian side. But the net result is it paralyzes life, and Israel simply cannot afford that over time. So what do you do if they're lobbing 6 missiles a day at you every single day? Your life is paralyzed economically. What you do is you escalate. And you want to have the ability to hurt them more than they hurt you. And you play the escalating ladder. At some point you want a ceiling, but you want to have the trump card at the end. And if you don't have the trump card, you worry about losing and then losing the war of attrition. Israelis have basically feared wars of attrition ever since. That's why they have an offensive strategic doctrine. That's why they rely primarily on the Air Force. That's why they like quick wars where they can have overwhelming superiority. And so it takes them into a different direction. But the second reason really comes out of the 1967 war. And I agree with Avner that there are differences between 1967 and what we're facing now. But there are also similarities. And when you look at the Israeli calculations in 1967, a lot of it was not just about preempting an immediate war, but what would have happened in Israeli thinking had the Israelis not taken the opportunity that they had to wage a war which they thought would be a winning war. It would have been that Nasser would have been seen to have intimidated Israel against war. He would be the big and powerful guy, and Israel is the weak one. He would have been considered the one to have stopped them from attacking Syria. He would have rallied, as he did immediately before the war, Arab colleagues like his previous enemies, like the King of Jordan. Public opinion would have been on his side. All the while, you have a changing international strategic environment in which the Europeans are withdrawing from the Middle East. The U.S. is thinking about its alliances in the region. Israel would have been seen to be the little country with the rising Arab power. And Arabs would have thought of Israel as a temporary entity as they had before. Whereas with 67, it really changed, in Israeli mind, the strategic picture. And 1967 is seen to have been the year that anchored Arab existence in Israel's existence in the Arab world. I think the Israelis have an assessment of where their deterrence is right now in the region. They think it's not working. They think the Middle East is going through a lot of upheavals where Arab countries are redefining what they stand for, including Egypt next door. The U.S. is pulling out of the Middle East, pulled out of Iraq, reducing its presence, less influential. Global shift of powers going to Asia. People are making an assessment about where's the future. And this is an opportunity for Israel, if in fact it think it can succeed, to show Iran to be the paper tiger like Nasser, if in fact that were the case. Now, not everybody thinks that way because there are weaknesses with this logic. One weakness is, Iran may turn out not to be a paper tiger. There are a lot of assumptions here that are wrong. And second, I think what we've seen in Iran, in South Lebanon in 2006, and in Gaza in 2008, is that it had actually the opposite reaction in the Arab world, where people thought that Israel is actually weak by virtue of the ability of others to hurt it. So there are problems with this logic, but I think enough people believe it, and there's enough of an opportunity that it's luring when you tie it with all the other objective analysis there, and that's why I fear, and I think it would be a disaster personally, not just for the region, but for Israel and for the U.S., if in fact Israel were to start a war, not because I think I know how Iran can respond. None of us do. We don't even know what their capacities are. But think for a moment about this. Israel and Iran have never been at war with each other, period. They have never been at war with each other. There's a rhetorical conflict going on. They've in fact been allies in the past. But you start conflict with the Persian civilization over an issue over which there is unanimity, and as Karim pointed out, there will be a rallying around the flag. You can bet 100%, and that will probably extend the regime's life. But Israel will be at war with an Iranian civilization, not for tomorrow or the next day, whether or not they can fire a missile or not, but it will be something they will not forget for a long time. I hope it doesn't happen. Thank you very much.